and enjoy.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Dan Bartz. I currently work for Fiat Chrysler in Auburn Hills, Michigan. I also am the chair of the SAE On-Road Automated Driving Standards Committee, so if anyone has an interest in automated vehicle standards, you can talk to me after the talk. So I've been doing automated driving for about 20 years, and a lot of people think, wow, that's got to be since the very beginning. Well, I'm going to talk a bit about the beginning that was well before that. So this is 2005 DARPA Challenge out in the Nevada desert. I was on the Carnegie team, which did the two red Humvees you can see in the picture here. But we're going to go back and a little bit further than that. So I'll start with some quotes. Yeah, we're upgrading from horses. That horses knew how to do a lot of stuff that cars don't. Okay, so I like to start a little bit further back. This is 1895. Chicago Times-Herald sponsored the first automobile race in the United States. And of the 20 cars that entered, only 2 finished. And the race was 50 miles around Chicago. The car that finished first, Duryea, finished in, I believe it was something like 10 hours to go like 50 miles. And the reason is not that the car wasn't faster than that, but the amount of time he spent having to fix it along the way. You know, the reliability of the early cars was pretty horrible. A few years later, Henry Ford decides to challenge Mr. Whitten from the quote earlier to a race. Everyone knew that Whitten had the most powerful, the fastest cars on the road, but Ford wanted to try with a car he built himself in his garage, the Ford Sweepstakes. And ultimately, Ford wins the race, not because his car can accelerate faster or has a bigger engine, but because he didn't have to fix it. The reliability was one of the big kind of hallmarks as to what allowed Ford to win the race and also to raise the venture capital off of this race to start the Ford Motor Car Company. And in a few years, Ford is producing Model Ts as one of the most widely sought after appliances on the road. But every year the Model T was exactly the same as the year before. There wasn't a whole lot of reason to buy a new Model T other than your old Model T wore out. In a few years, car companies like General Motors and Chrysler realized if you wanted to get a customer to buy a new car and then to buy another new car, you had to constantly keep them evolving. You had to constantly change. We also had to make them into fashion products, whereas Ford said you can afford any color as long as you want, as long as it's black. The other automakers were pushing the limits of what different paints can do, different styling features. And the annual model change really was a big driver. If you think about, this was decades before the iPhone made the smartphone into a fashion product. In fact, you had a new phone every year because last year's phone wasn't cool enough. The auto industry had kind of figured this out in the late 20s, early 30s. Also, some innovations that the automobile industry came up with, the cell phone industry would borrow, was the idea of turning in your old car to get money for your new car. You didn't used to be able to take your old car to the same place you would buy a new car from, but the dealers realized if they would buy old cars in the process of selling a new car, that you'd be more likely to buy a new car. Also, on-the-spot financing, being able to take your car payment instead of one big check, you could make it into monthly payments. Allowed people to buy much more car than they would otherwise have done. And pretty soon, Chevrolet was outselling Ford, despite the fact that Chevrolet costs 3 times as much as a Ford. And then within a few years, Chrysler was even outselling Ford, with a lot more expensive cars, just because they're able to make them more economical, at least the customer to believe so. But if every year you're bringing in new technology, well, at some point you're going to say, well, what's the thing we haven't thought of yet? What's the big prize we want to get to? And it was pretty clear from the 1930s that airplanes were already getting autopilot. They're already starting to work on auto landing systems. And some few of the marketing people realized that, hey, there might be a future in this for the automobile.
When the car leaves the factory, only one thing is needed for safety, and that's a careful driver. If the manufacturer could equip every car with an automatic driving mechanism, the car would always do just what it should do when it got out on the road.
And so this is actually it's a very short clip from a much longer advertising piece about what would an automated car do. If we had an automated car, what would it do in all of these different driving circumstances? And since we don't have automated cars, you as the human have to fill in the role of what that automated car would do. And these were actually short movies, or short clips that were put in front of movies the way we have trailers today, but companies like General Motors used that time in front of the movies to educate the customer on something about this new complex product that they were buying that was kind of scary to people who didn't understand them. Also, you had a lot of very targeted advertising. You had these big shows. You had like a Parade of Progress, which is kind of like a mobile Apple Genius Bar that went town to town to town to explain to customers all the wonders of technology, particularly automotive technology. You had publications like this, a Power Primer. It's a booklet that GM published to explain how engines worked to a customer who wasn't used to motor cars, used to horses. And they thought this was important because people tend to be afraid of what they don't understand. And if you think about the very early days of the automobile, the fear was from the lack of understanding, and the education of the customer was a really important part of trying to build acceptance. There was radio programs put on TV shows, all sorts of media activities are put on to try to educate the customer about this wonderful new automobile. By 1939, this is actually a poster from the 1939 World's Fair. This is not a Rocketeer movie poster, but the sky was a limit in terms of where we're gonna, where future is gonna be for all sorts of technologies. Obviously,
the 1960s express motorway. Along the ledge of this beautiful precipice, traffic moves at unreduced rates of speed. Safe distance between cars is maintained by automatic radio control. Curved sides assist the driver in keeping his car within the proper lane under all circumstances. The keynote of this motorway: safety. Safety with increased speed.
I like the increased speed part. So this was a pretty enormous interactive display put together by a designer by the name of Norman Bell Geddes. GM contracted him to put together the Futurama exhibit, and there's a video like recording of the entire exhibit, and it goes on for like half an hour because it's just like diorama after diorama after diorama. This is one of his future cities, and he predicted at some point in the future that America would have these highways crossing it from one shore to the other shore, and that if we design them right, you could get from New York to San Francisco in 24 hours if you could just maintain 100 miles an hour the entire way. And this was kind of the basis for his automated highway concept. He later wrote a book called Magic Motorways, in which he explained more of the concepts behind automation and how they would improve safety and improve productivity, but then also looking at some of the challenges to automated highways. For example, the capacity of the highway, the number of cars you can cram per inch is not the limiting factor. It's usually the ability to get cars on and off the highway. It's the ability to get cars from one interchange to another. And if your bottlenecks can't handle the high volume, then you're not going to be able to put more cars. And so this is a highway interchange he designed to allow you to maintain 100 miles an hour from one highway to another. He also shows these super exit ramps that would have several exit ramps for the same exit in a row that would kind of fuse out the traffic so that you could get cars off of the highway as opposed to having them back you up several miles. The basic concept for guidance was the technology we knew at the time, a magnetic wire that we would, or electromagnetic wire that we would follow with electric pickups. But once you had the ability for the wire to communicate to the car and the car to communicate to the wire, you could start to do some really cool coordinated maneuvers. And this is a signalless intersection concept you may have seen in some of the YouTube videos out there. But if cars can talk to each other, then they wouldn't have to slow down for an intersection. They can just set their timing so that they would pass right through. This is out of his book from 1940. And he goes on, and there's several quotes in there about car-to-car communication and driver assistance technologies. I think I clipped them out of this talk for just to keep it a little bit cleaner, but this book is so old it's in public domain. So if anyone is interested in reading about what the future of automated driving was from 1940, it's actually a fascinating, a really well-written book. Well, all this wonderful technology is great, but you know, we had the reality of the Second World War was just about to happen. And the Second World War had massive impact on technology. You know, we went from the basis of piston engines up through jet engines. We had developed the atomic bomb during this period. We had started to develop guided missile technology that would pave way for the Cold War. And after the war was over, all of these engineers and developers went back to their day jobs. This gentleman, by the way, in this picture is a guy named Bill Spreitzer. He was a kind of a mentor to me when I started at GM Research. He is sitting here and behind the seat of a turbine-powered Firebird 2, which is the first titanium-bodied car ever developed. By the way, this is before the SR-71 existed. In the next video, it'll show the concept for automation that he was working on with a number. I mean, he was one of the engineers working during this time period.
Move to electronic control strip in center lane.
By the way, the calibration sequence is much longer. I just cut it down for
You're now under
brevity, but.
Hands off steering.
And so this video actually goes on for like 15 minutes. It's really cute, but I cut it short just to keep the pace. But some of the technology that needed to be developed was steer-by-wire. In fact, full drive-by-wire needed to be developed. And since fly-by-wire didn't exist yet, it was something that had to be invented. So General Motors and RCA developed something called the unit control, which is the first anything by wire. Allowed you to do joystick-based vehicle control. A few years later, when they developed the Firebird 3 concept car, it was a fully operational drive-by-wire system. It used electrohydraulic servos and actually a transistorized computer, which is pretty new for the 1950s. And you can see here the vacuum tube bank that made up the power side of the computing for the Firebird 3. But there was there's a full engineering analysis I was able to find in the Berkeley Library that goes through the entire fault tree analysis and then all the different failures that can happen and how they were able to keep the vehicle to operate safely under those circumstances. Because even back then, 95% of accidents were caused by humans, and if we could get rid of those 95%, we would be as safe as, well, cars are today. Because even though the human hasn't improved, improving the safety of the car has been the major contribution to why cars are safer today. Here you can see the magnetic pickups in the right under the front bumper of the Firebird 3. And those were what they used to figure out where the wire was. The wire also communicated what speed the vehicle should be going, and if it needed to stop because there was some obstacle on the ground in front of the vehicle didn't have the sensing it would need to do that, so the infrastructure had to do the sensing. And the coordination was done all centrally. If you've ever been to like the Computer History Museum, they talk about the SAGE computer system, where one giant supercomputer monitored all of the radar dishes around the U.S. to track incoming Russian missiles, so that we would have one coordinated response. That was kind of the thought process at the time, is that you would centralize all of the computation. And if you go and look at some of the papers, especially from the American Association for State Highway Transportation Officials, AASHTO, they were talking about what is the algorithms needed to do the guidance, the route guidance, and figure out how car A gets to destination B and coordinating across a large network. they were already working on the algorithms back then to be able to do the centralized control. Yeah.
Ian, how much of the wired track was ever built? Do you know offhand?
So I know that Michigan got approved $3 million to do 100 miles.
Okay.
I don't know, I can't confirm that they did it, but there were 3 states that were competing for the first 100 miles of track. The GM Proving Grounds in Arizona, the entire high-speed loop was automated. This technology actually had been used by automakers for years to do a lot of the durability testing. But there were articles in the New York Times that talked about the state competition to see who would build the first automated highway. It was Michigan, Ohio, and Maine that were in the competition.
Unit control is a new concept in steering, designed to simplify your driving task.
Well, this guy's an engineer. It's not
Especially
fair.
developed electronic computers to control hydraulic power servos, which actuate the brakes, throttle, and steering. Push forward to accelerate, steer left or right. Pull back for braking. Rotation of the control knob selects forward, reverse, or park. There is no mechanical connection between the control knob and the front wheels, but car motion feedback is supplied to the driver by the mass of the knob. To this, we have also added auto guide, an automatic guidance system, and cruise control. 2 pickup coils mounted under the front of the car straddle a current-carrying wire embedded in the highway.
Want to sit back and relax? Well then, set in the speed you want to drive and switch over to automatic guidance. Release the stick, and Firebird 3 is on its own, receiving its commands from a wire in the road.
It's been a long time in the works.
So even though centralized computing control was kind of the in concept at the time, car companies were starting to look at taking aviation sensors and putting them on the car. I mean, the police radar gun had been invented by the 1940s. So in fact, I think in 1946, the New York Times speculated that collision warning could be in the road by 1947. So this was the thinking of the time period. With this concept car called the Cadillac Cyclone, the 2 big nose cones actually were functional. They were the transmit and receive radomes for the onboard radar system. And the mechanism by which this car gave a warning to the driver was similar to how mechanical alarm clocks worked, electromechanical ones, where you had the 2 needles, and when they touched, the alarm would go off. In this case, there was a proximity needle that told you the distance to the car in front of you, and a stopping distance needle that told you how long it was going to take for you to stop. And when they touched, it told you were getting too close. During the same time period, Chrysler, the company I worked for, was working on what we now call adaptive cruise control. It was a radar-aided braking system. So the GM was showing off a collision warning system. Chrysler was working on an adaptive cruise control system that they called autopilot. And eventually they brought something called autopilot into production, but they realized that having brakes control the car was probably a bad idea with 1950s radars. And so when autopilent went into production, it was just regular cruise control. It's the first cruise control. They also learned within the first year that autopilot is a really bad name for cruise control, and they stopped using it after the first year. But there are a number of articles that talked about some of the research they were doing in trying to do radar-based vehicle control. In fact, the issues that they had with radar back then are still issues we have today. Is the car straight in front of me in my lane, or just straight in front of me? Maybe he's in the next lane and he's going around a corner. How does my radar see as I go up and down hills? And so on. So a lot of these issues we've gotten better with maps and with different types of tracking algorithms, but they still are fundamental issues that we have to deal with. They were just the dominant issues at this time period. Now, what's also interesting is how much the press started to pick up on the automated driving kind of push. This was Popular Science, the car that drives itself. But just looking at the New York Times alone, found 60 articles over 10 years on automated driving from 1955 to 1965, including arguments by what the organization that would become AAA as to whether we should push for our driver assistance technologies or just ban driving altogether and go straight to automated driving. This was the debate being had in the insurance communities. But despite the amount of money and the amount of press, a lot of the automakers were kind of late to recognize where culture was going. So by the late 1950s, the hot rod movement was in full swing. You had Beach Boys doing entire albums on nothing about custom cars. And by the early 60s, the automakers kind of got the message and started shifting production towards much bigger displacement engines. Started to take technology off of cars that we already had. Fuel injection was available on late 50s, early 60s Corvettes, but not available later in the 60s because it was getting in the way of more power. A lot of other technologies, automatic high beam dimming, even power windows were pulled out in order to really fuel the customer's demand for more performance. And the hot rod begot the muscle car. And it was hard for the automakers, for the researchers to justify all the research into automation, taking the steering wheel out of the driver's hand when customers were paying big dollars to have more performance. Also at the same time, we had something that was kind of known at the time period, automation anxiety. It was the fear that robots were going to take all the jobs. And some of the first industrial robots were starting to find their way into factories, and pretty soon the articles about car automation being good gets replaced by how automation is going to take away all the jobs. And this was such a big deal that President Johnson actually had to form a commission to investigate whether automation was going to destroy the U.S. economy. That was the type of fear at the time. And kind of as a background to this, the automakers who had these really advanced research projects decided to shift towards the space program, which had a little bit better of a kind of a PR value. And so this is actually a comic book about some of the Chrysler projects that aren't cars. First and foremost was the Redstone and Jupiter missiles. Redstone was the first rocket that put an American into space. The Jupiter, I think, was one of our first ICBMs, but they were developed by Chrysler. A lot of the Apollo program was developed by General Motors, and if you remember the Firebird, the lunar rover actually has the same underlying digital or electronic joystick. The unit control was actually adapted from the Firebird to the lunar rover as part of the Apollo program. Also, GM was the prime contractor on navigation and on fly-by-wire. The Apollo was the first use of an analog fly-by-wire system. A few years later, several years later, when the space shuttle was being developed, GM was also the prime contractor on digital fly-by-wire. And so fly-by-wire is an automotive technology that found its way into space as opposed to the other way around. And a lot of this automated vehicle technology, what could be reused, got repurposed into the space program. In fact, a lot of the inertial guided systems that the space program used were talked about in car research papers by the mid-1950s. And I also mentioned the Firebird 2 had a titanium body, while the SR-71 of the 60s was one of the first aircraft to use titanium sheet metal, but a decade after had been used in research automobiles. So the technology does continue to evolve. The idea of using sensors as opposed to central control slowly kind of picks up steam.
Operating the system is just slightly different from today's cruise control. Once the cruising speed is set,
this is a video from, I think, the early 90s, maybe late 80s.
Between vehicles. As you approach a slow
showing off a prototype
your car
automotive radar.
adjusts its speed to maintain the preset distance, allowing you to pass if you wish and resume your previous speed.
By 95, with a lot of funding from the Department of U.S. Department of Transportation, U.S. Department of Defense, Carnegie Mellon was able to do coast-to-coast automated driving, 98% hands-free, I believe. And a lot of technology, here, I can't remember which was the spin-off that they created, but there was an entire automotive vision company that came out of this work. But there was a big push in the 90s to do a new automated highway system, this time using buried magnets as opposed to buried wires, and using radar and vehicle-to-vehicle communication. It really didn't take off for a number of reasons, one of which was that you had to have the highway either be automated or manual. We still couldn't do both, and there still wasn't a big customer pull for, you know, this full automated control. The Pentagon had also been spending, like I said, they actually had funded some of this. They spent millions of dollars trying to develop automated vehicle technology for use in all sorts of military applications, and they decided instead of paying contractors to write research reports about why it couldn't be done, they were given the task by Congress to have 1/3 of the ground combat vehicles automated by 2015, and so they decided to host a competition called the DARPA Challenge that represented basically the trip from Kuwait to Baghdad. That was at least the nominal where the range came from. And the DARPA was expecting all these defense contractors to show up and show who's got the best technology. Well, it turns out it was universities and car companies that came to this defense competition and kind of showed the defense company, but didn't make the defense companies look all that great. Oshkosh, I think, was the only defense company that competed, and they actually finished, but they finished well beyond the 10 hours that DARPA gave them to finish the competition. They came in like 17 hours or something like that, when Stanford and Carnegie were in the 7-hour time frame. But a lot of the alumni from this competition went on to start other projects. Chris Urmson and Sebastian Thrun started the Waymo project, or what became the Waymo project, which is the Google autonomous car. This is one of our vans that have been actually redesigned to support the drive-by-wire and redundant hardware and redundant electrical power to support this, plus the very, very high power level required to run all the computers and sensors, which is into many kilowatts. It's not something you would get out of a standard automotive electrical system. And so the more recent history I want to get into, but what I do want to talk about is, you know, if this consumer was a big part of killing the technology in the past, you know, what can we expect from the consumers today, and how might we be able to change some of their minds? And so the rest of this I gave at within the Chrysler design office. A bunch of guys who really like cars and really like to think about like how awesome driving is, and there'd been this big thing about how car culture was dead. Well, Atlantic Monthly was the first one that says millennials weren't going to buy any more cars, only to find out a few years later that, oh yeah, they're buying cars once the recession cleared up. More interesting, MTV did a pretty extensive survey called, which was called Now Millennials How to Drive, but they found that 70% of millennials enjoy driving versus 58% of boomers and 66% of Gen Xers, and 60% of millennials feel like they're losers among their peers without cars. 76% of young people said it's important that their next car feel like it gives them control. 63% of millennials say it's important that their car helps them become who they want to be, versus 50% of boomers and 24% of Gen Xers, which I find surprising that Gen Xers are the ones that didn't seem to like cars in this one. But, and they had a number of other things that they found out about millennials were actually much more car passionate than the Gen Xers, and even to many extent than the baby boomers. And they said, this is not what we've been hearing. So Beach Boys albums don't sell anymore, but I like this one because it's the only rap song that talks about radar. One of the interesting things I found was that the songs of the Beach Boys songs, and they're singing about custom cars, and you compare it with modern rap songs singing about custom cars, they're often singing about the same things, just with slightly more profanity now. But I found this interesting study on Medium.com. This was car brand references in rap songs over time. And a few things you can note from here is that during the recession, fewer people sang about cars. And fewer people sang about the really expensive cars. But since the recession, people are, the rappers are singing more about cars than they've ever sung before. And I think it's just kind of an interesting way of looking at the, we talked earlier about changing your perspective. Well, this is just a different perspective and looking at how customers think about cars from the kind of the culture standpoint. Another statistic you hear a lot is that only 24% of 16-year-olds had driver's license in 2014, which is down from 27% in 2011, 31% in 2008, and 46% in 1983, according to the University of Michigan. Well, this chart shows the different restrictions put on driver's licenses as part of the move towards graduated driver's licenses. In fact, many states you can't get a driver's license at 16. And so it's pretty hard to expect that you're going to have a lot of drivers at 16 when fewer states allow you to get a driver's license at 16, and the states that do make it much, much harder. In fact, it's not until you're 18 that it becomes a lot easier to get a driver's license. And so the fact that that these statistics about the decline in 16-year-olds with driver's licenses also seems to correspond with the increase in number of states with graduated driver's licenses. There might be more to the story than just fewer young people want to drive. You don't remember this show?
I don't believe this. Playing chicken with a 10-ton semi.
Got in the car, just drove around the truck and steered itself.
Yes, it's marvelous, isn't it?
I hate it. I like to make my own decisions.
Well, the microprocessor deduced that you were acting contrary to
Another
your
engineer,
best
by the way.
interests. It had two choices. Either to slow down or to maneuver around the obstacles.
Well, then why didn't this thing slow down instead of driving around the truck? It would have been a lot safer.
Well,
why? Come on. Did I find a flaw in their perfect machine here?
no flaw, I assure you. It's just that...
It's just what?
Well, it was showing off for you.
What?
And so, Michael's reaction, it kind of typifies a lot of what we hear for people first getting into automated vehicles is, I don't want to give up control. But if you watch the show, and actually I think the show was pretty ahead of its time, is there's actually a relationship that gets formed between Michael Knight and Kit. And Michael drives the car when he feels like, he doesn't drive the car when he doesn't feel like, and it becomes more about a freedom to choose when to drive than just, I get to drive now and tomorrow I don't get to drive. And so I'm going to talk a bit now about building new user experiences in automated driving and how to make automated driving exciting for people who actually like to drive. And I am one of those people. My current car, I have both a racing package and an ADAS package on it. It was really hard to find a car with both. I'd actually drive 5 hours, when I was living in the Bay Area, I had to drive 5 hours down to Ventura to pick it up because it was the only place that had one, Charger Road and Track. So you have heard of the levels of automation. I know Barb Wendling would kill me because I've oversimplified them, but this was for the design folks. So at level 0, your car doesn't do anything continuously on its own. When you get to level 1, is where one of the aspects of driving, either gas and brake or steering, can be automated, but not both aspects. And so I represent this as feet off. Adaptive cruise control, you can take your feet off the pedals and have it control the gas and the brake, but you still have to do the steering. At level 2, I show this as hands off, but this is where the automated vehicle system is doing both the steering and the gas and the brake. But you still have to maintain eyes on the road because you have to be aware of anything that jumps out in front of you. This is like the Tesla autopilot today. There's a whole bunch of things it doesn't know how to detect. And you have to constantly be monitoring this situation because it's not going to know what it doesn't know how to detect. As we get to level 3 automation, now you can start to take your eyes off the road because the vehicle knows what it's capable of doing and what it's not capable of doing. And if it gets into a situation it's not capable of handling, it will give you fair notice, whatever notice that's going to be. Some people say 10 seconds, it's not really agreed upon in the industry, but it will give you notice with sufficient time for you to get back in control, so that you don't have to constantly be watching the environment, but you can't go to sleep. And so I show this his eyes off. At level 4, now you can go to sleep, because if the vehicle gets into in above its head, it knows how to pull off to the side of the road and stop itself. It knows what environments it can and can't drive in, and so it doesn't necessarily able to handle everything, but it knows what it can handle, and it knows how to put itself in a safe state so that you don't have to do that. Now you can start to, theoretically take steering wheels out of cars. The Waymo cars down in Phoenix are level 4, but level 4 also allows the manufacturer to say, hey, it works here, but doesn't work there. So a Waymo vehicle can work in Phoenix with great weather, but not in Detroit in a snowstorm. As the manufacturer, you get to define what's called the operational design domain, or what conditions the car is allowed to work in. And we define level 5 as pretty much like level 4, except it has to work in all conditions. It has to do everything that a human is expected to be able to do. So driving in a snowstorm in Detroit, driving on the off-road, driving in Dutton, which is a dirt road in Rochester Hills. It has to deal with the fact that there's water on the road and you would be expected to drive through it. And so level 5, now you get to the point where the vehicle is as capable as a human. But the levels don't say you have to take the steering wheel out of the car, and you don't say that you have to give up all control. You just say that the system is capable of doing the control, and when the system is in the control, how much responsibility does the operator have? By the way, any questions on the levels? I know I super simplified them here, but I think it's a little easier than the really long written out ones. Next thing I talk about is trust, and this is probably the #1 challenge in automated driving, is the trust of the end user. Right now, there have been a number of studies on how many people would be willing to get in a car, use an automated vehicle that didn't have a steering wheel or brake pedals, and the number was at I think it was 6% of the American populace. After a few of the more recent incidents, it's like 4% of the American populace. It's gone down because of some of the negative press that has been associated with automated vehicles, and unless we can address the trust aspect of automated vehicles, you're not going to build the customer base. So there's the aspect of the customer wants to drive, but there's also the aspect that the customer, I want to put it this way, the customer thinks he's a better driver than the automation is. No matter how big the automation is, the customer almost always is going to think he's a better driver. And I'll give you some both a historical and modern context. In the 1950s, when the automakers were talking about automated cars, was also the era that Ford brought out seatbelts for the first time. 1957, as part of the lifeguard package. Ford sales plummeted when they brought out seatbelts. The general assumption is that customers associated seatbelts with the car being unsafe. Mr. Ford commented that McNamara, who was the president of Ford at the time, was selling safety while General Motors was selling cars. The problem was that McNamara was selling safety by showing how unsafe driving was. He had all sorts of videos and press clipping, or advertisements that showed that cars are really dangerous, and he's trying to advocate that seatbelts are a way to help. But the seatbelt was perceived as protecting you from your own incompetent driving, and a study done by Motor Trend also in 1957 showed that 95% of Americans thought that they were fantastic drivers, and that they didn't need safety technology. A similar study was done in 2011, and 95% of Americans thought that they were fantastic drivers, and that it was the other drivers that were unsafe. And as we know from a certain radio program that all the kids are above average, the fact that most Americans consider themselves fantastic, it's hard to sell the customer on the fact that they're the safety problem. And so safety, while it's probably one of the most important aspects of automated driving, is also one of the hardest to sell to the customer that you need safety. It's easy to sell. All your neighbors need automated driving so that you're safer from them. It's one of the reasons why side airbags are easier to sell than airbags were initially, because side airbags protect you from other people. And so the message and how we communicate safety to the customer, I think is one of the things that has been kind of standing in the way from the adoption is kind of the implied aspect that the customer is unsafe. While we know that the customer is unsafe, a lot of the research shows is that risks taken voluntarily versus risks taken involuntarily, there's a customer expectance, of the involuntary risks to be 1,000 times safer before you get to acceptance. And I'll give you an actual numerical case in point, or let's give you a non-numerical and then a numerical. You can go to McDonald's and eat a hamburger and you know that it's greasy and it's probably bad for you. Customers are willing to accept that. But they find out there's pink slime in that hamburger and it has this like 0.01% chance of something that they don't, something really minor, but they weren't told about it, they get really upset. And so people are willing to take on some of the big health negatives voluntarily, but they get upset when they find out that there was something held for them. Another case in point is the aircraft industry. Private aviation versus the public airlines. The public airlines are 1,000 times safer on passenger mile than private aviation. Yet there isn't a whole lot of complaints when a private airplane goes down, but when there's a commercial airliner that goes down, it's a really big deal. And even today, if you look over the last 10 years, I think we averaged 1 fatality per every 3 trillion air passenger miles, something along those lines, which 3 trillion passenger miles is equivalent to what we have in the auto industry in 1 year of driving. And so that's 40,000 fatalities for 3 trillion passenger miles. So about 40,000 to 1 safer flying an airplane than driving in a car, yet there are a lot more people who are afraid of airplanes than of cars. In the car case, it's often you have some control over your safety, whereas in the aircraft industry, you're putting your hands into someone else. And so even though it's not a rational fear, the scientific evidence shows that there is this additional expectation of safety when you give up control. And it's something that we have to address in terms of a kind of a customer acceptance. I showed you earlier Kit. This is the squiggle from Alexa. I think some of the things we're doing with smart devices, you're kind of building a more conversational relationship. I think this is part of how we build acceptance of automated vehicles. It's developing a new way to communicate. I give examples of when the hybrid came out. People were scared of hybrid technology when it first came out, and it wasn't until we started to see these power flow displays in the nav systems that showed how all the different mechanisms were working, when was it charging, when was it discharging, that people are actually able to say, oh, that's kind of how it works, and started to build acceptance. In fact, the most enthusiastic hybrid drivers, the Leonardo DiCaprios, were going around telling all their friends how great their hybrids are and showing off all the displays. And if you know people who have Teslas and autopilot, they want to show off all the little nuances of the technology, designing new interfaces to help communicate what the system is doing, why it did what it did, even though that's not necessary to have an operational system any more than a power flow display is necessary to operate a hybrid. It was an important aspect towards the education of how the system worked, kind of like I mentioned with the earlier days of the automobile, but just done kind of more interactively. There's also one aspect to this. If you think about building cars for the blind, one of the SAE committees we have looks at people with disabilities, and one thing people from the National Federation of Blind told us is they didn't want to be cargo. They didn't want to be treated as cargo. And there hasn't been a whole lot of work done on HMI for blind people in automated vehicles. There's systems that can describe to the customer, not just, I'm taking off now, but what's going on around you, which is something that blind people can pick up from the human drivers and the Uber that they take. So often they will describe to the customer why he made that sharp turn because this guy cut him off. That type of a relationship I think we're going to need to look at, particularly for people with disabilities. But I think if you, as Universal Design says, if you can design something for people with disabilities or limitations, it's going to work all much better for everyone else. I mentioned the iStore, the Genius Bar is kind of a way that Apple was able to get around technophobia, was able to take, smart devices from being an appliance that was, the BlackBerries when they were like, you had to be a really technical user to understand them. You didn't have, your grandma didn't go and buy a BlackBerry to the point where everyone and everyone's neighbor had an iPhone, and if you had the last year's iPhone, it wasn't cool. The Genius Bar was one way they were able to help get around some of the technical education aspect to it, and try to make the experience a lot more user-friendly. I think this is something that is missing from the auto industry, or maybe missing from the US auto industry. I know in Germany, when you go and buy a new Mercedes, you can have the option to pick it up at the factory, and they will walk you through all the systems on your car works. That's not something we typically get a whole lot of in car transactions as they happen now. And I think it's something that is important to explain the technology the customers have. Most customers don't understand the features of their car, particularly a lot of the ADAS features. And so looking at how we educate the customer, I think is going to be an important part, not just for tomorrow's technologies, but even for today's.
As you wish, Mr. Knight.
I think that's interesting because, especially as we've transitioned to electric cars, some of us, got some of these early Leafs when we knew more about the car coming from the dealer than the dealer did, and you could kind of feel for the people who knew they wanted it but needed that hand-holding and training, and the dealers were just not equipped to do that.
Because they were often like simple questions that people, is the battery going to die in like 5 years and stuff like that?
Or just how do I charge it tonight when I get home, or things like that.
By the way, the fear of like batteries dying, there are Priuses now with 600,000 miles on the original battery, and they're still maintaining a full charge capacity. The revolution we've made in battery technology has been pretty amazing, but most people don't know that. They think about their cell phone, that its battery can't hold a charge after a year and a half. It's not the same technology that's going into automobiles.
Actually, also, I think there's a huge first impression aspect to that, because I personally know, I lived in Ecuador for a while, and the Priuses there had a 1 degree temperature issue in their batteries, and after about 2 years, the batteries pretty much die, because they have a lot of elevation, and the recuperation cycle would be much faster. And so basically the whole country is ruined for hybrids because of that, because the technology was put out, the first impression that people bought those vehicles with tax exemptions and said, hey, I'll buy a cheap car. And then 2 years later, they said, oh, well, now you need a $15,000 repair. And so that really ruined the country for hybrids.
Sounds like Leafs in Phoenix.
It's also like diesels in the U.S. Regardless of what you think of diesels, there's an impression of diesel that's not, kept up with where the technology's at. Half of Europe is diesel right now, and but Americans still think of diesels like they were, 20, 30 years ago, or I guess now we've given them new reasons to consider diesels to be horrible, so they can't rely about what their emissions are.
They're clean. Oh wait.
But
As you wish, Mr. Knight. But since you are still recovering from your ordeal, and I detect we're in a slightly irritable mood caused by fatigue, may I suggest you put the car in the auto cruise mode for safety's sake?
No, you may not. And that's final. Good night.
Good night.
So this one is interesting. Michael falls asleep a few minutes later, and Kit has to has to help him out of getting pulled over by the cops. But in this case, you have Kit is detecting Michael's fatigue, his drowsiness. There's this not necessarily great dialogue going on, but the fact that the car is understanding of the human. One, it's an absolute necessity if you're going to try to do level 3, and there's a lot of people who don't think we should ever do level 3. To do level 3, you have to understand the customer, you have to understand, their state, you have to understand whether they're going to fall asleep or not, and that's a much different challenge than trying to diagnose sensor failure. It's not necessarily an impossible challenge, it's just a different challenge. But even when you develop vehicles that are level 5, I think you still want to have the capability for the vehicle to understand as much about the human as the human's going to understand about the vehicle. Especially if you want to have like I said, especially if you want to have a more rich kind of interaction model. And I'll talk a little bit about some of these systems as we look at another really cool toy. This is the F-35, and despite the fact that it is covered in sensors, I still think it's pretty sexy. This is one of the things I talked about with our styling friends. Is there's cameras down here and cameras on the nose, and this is a big camera sensor, and there's all these sensors are actually kind of integrated into like these muscle bulges to make it look more muscular, and it was part of the kind of design theme. And to anyone who doesn't believe it, yes, airplanes are styled by stylists because pilots don't want to fly ugly airplanes. The F-117A stealth fighter is painted black despite the fact that it is not an optimal stealth color, because the fighter pilots didn't want to fly kind of navy blue molten looking camouflage airplanes. They wanted black. I kind of think that the big sensor under the bottom looks a little bit like some bling, but
Pull up, pull up! I am known to air crew of the F-18 as Bitchin' Betty. Roll right, roll right! That's a time-honored tradition in the Air Force and Navy.
She is the oral alert in the aircraft for when there's something that's really important that a little light bulb isn't enough to get your attention.
We trust that she's telling us what we need to do, and we do what she says.
I got a phone call one day from a friend who wanted me to come over. She had an air crew there, and he got the call to roll right. Roll right, roll right! I mean, it's now. And he did. And he said if he hadn't rolled right when it said to, he'd have gone in the drink. He'd have died. And that's pretty overwhelming to hear things like that.
so the Bitching Betty, which is as it's called in the U.S., I think it's there's all sorts of other names in other countries, but every country has their own version of the Bitching Betty. But actually, it forms there's a relationship that forms between the pilot and this communication system. And the fact that they've chosen a female voice, in fact it was a stern female voice, because that's what tested to be the most effective at getting the pilot to do what they needed to do in the fastest possible time. You know, it was driven by science, but there are psychological reasons why that is the case. Also, one of the things to think about is, you know, an airplane like the F-35 is one of the most automated pieces of equipment on the planet. Nobody thinks of it as being boring to fly because it's so automated. It's because the pilots have control over the automation. And I've got another set of slide decks about the interior design of the F-35, which, by the way, they got rid of like pretty much all of the switches and there's only one display in the F-35. It's like a 24-inch LCD, and then all of the controls are on the joysticks. It's really a amazing simplification of the user experience from previous designs, but that's a different slide deck for a different time. I want to talk about off-road autonomy. I worked on the predecessor to this robot.
The terrain was even more in its favor.
And so off-road autonomy is a whole different aspect to autonomy. But you know, imagine a customer who wants to go rafting, and you know, somebody needs to pick them up at the bottom of the river. You know, if you leave someone behind so they have to drive the vehicle to pick you up, that means they don't get to go rafting with you, or you have to play some gymnastics to make sure that there are vehicles at the bottom of the river to pick people up. Well, if you had off-road autonomy, your vehicle could just meet you at the bottom of the river. Or this is a parallel parking application developed by Stanford. A little bit of overkill, if you ask me, but you're showing that the ability to model complex nonlinear dynamics, ability to control the vehicle out of linear control. A similar project was done by, I think, Georgia Tech on what's called the Scandinavian Flick. It's a maneuver in rally racing, where you basically get the nose of the car to spin around the front wheels as you're going around a hairpin corner. You know, these are things that require a tremendous amount of driver skill and experience, or really good software and sensors. And it's one of the things where we can give average cars superhuman driving capabilities if there was a need for that. If for nothing else, you know, to avoid accidents at the limit of handling. Another feature that kind of came up was a BMW feature called Track Trainer. If you want to learn how to race a car on the right line with the right brake and the right acceleration, you want to do so from the driver's seat, well, BMW has Track Trainer. It's an autonomous training tool to help race car drivers learn how to race optimally.
It's coming to the first corner. Brake, please. Brake, brake, brake! Brake, brake!
22 as we brake to turn into Chicago. As we steam towards the hammerhead now, 100 miles an hour. And it's got to go hard on the brakes. It has. There it is. I'm not doing that. My foot is still nowhere near the pedals. It's turning in. Imagine if the British had built this. Well, we didn't get it quite right. That's what happened there. We just missed that, didn't we, dear? Is it going to lift before the follow-through? We're now up to 130 kph, 140. Apparently you can even put this on an M3 if you really want to frighten yourself to death. Going up to the tyres. Here we go. 120, 130. This is 95 miles an hour through the tyres. Bang on. Please don't get it wrong. Please don't get it wrong. Please don't get it wrong. And it's just changed up to 4th. Brake, 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 brake. Second to last corner. Come on. Oh, Stig, you are sacked. You are so sacked. It's unbelievable. Now.
Anyway, that's an automated feature I don't think most people would find boring. So, but it's a kind of using your creativity to think about, are there different ways we can build automation experiences for customers, particularly customers who spend a lot of money to buy cars. I mean, if Americans just wanted transportation, if the goal is really to get the cheapest from point A to point B, and I'm not picking on any car company in particular, but the Nissan Versa has a 27 cent per mile operating cost over 5 years. Nissan Versa is not in the top best-selling 30 cars in the U.S. The top best-selling cars in the U.S. Are three out of 4 of them are big trucks. You know, Ram, F-150, and Silverado, which are like closer to like $1.50 a mile to operate. And I can tell you, most of the time they're not towing anything. You know, people are buying these vehicles as expensive as they are because of an experience and a lifestyle and other reasons that have very little to do with transportation. I think, like Tesla did with their vehicles, when they, instead of marketing them purely on the ecological purposes, said, hey, we can make these cars that are really exciting to drive, more exciting than anything that has a gas engine in it, give them amazing dynamics and make them really fun. They gave customers a whole new reason to spend a whole lot of money on a car, and it's just a car that doesn't burn any gas along the way. I think if you want to get some of your higher end buyers to adopt this technology, it has to be done in a way that's really compelling, that you have to make people want the technology as opposed to trying to scare them into it. Anyway, so those are the slides I have for kind of a history, and then I'm going to end with a little musical number. Anyway, so that's my talk.
Nobody is that happy.
By the way, they have a FaceTime on this car. Yeah, they're using in-car video conferencing in 1956.
Good evening, modern traveler. Won't you be our guest? We have pushed buttons, living at a very step. There's automatically control in every bed, and every digested food is cooked by infrared.
Yummy. Anyway, and then this is my interpretation of what cars should have been, but as our 700 horsepower Hellcat. But any questions or comments or?
So do you think in 60 years from now they'll be looking back on us and laughing about how naive we were?
I don't think it's going to take 60 years, but I mean, there's a lot of things. There's a lot of things that they got right conceptually, but a lot of things, the timing was completely off, and I don't think they understood the customers as well as they could have. Yeah.
I'm one of those people that use a car as transportation. We've got a, 2000 Civic, 180,000 miles.
Okay.
Very economical. It sounds like it may be close to the Nissan that you were talking about. And I'm just hoping that it will last long enough that the technology is going to advance. I'm looking forward to these autonomous vehicles, the alternative fuel vehicles. One of my concerns is life of the vehicle. You know, can we expect cars that are made now to last? My car's now 20 years old.
Okay.
And I'm assuming it will last another 5 years. Will the current cars last 25 years, or should we expect a shorter life of the vehicle?
So I was actually asked the question by a senior VP at our company, how do you make a car that lasts 1 million miles? I mean, today, if you look at cars that are designed for, you know, taxi duty, you know, a Crown Victoria or a Mercedes E-Class can get to about 250,000 miles. In fact, almost any form of ground transportation today can get to about 250,000 miles before it has to be overhauled. It doesn't matter if it's a car, a bus, a train, you have to do a powertrain overhaul at the very least. But if you want the body to last for 1 million miles, you know, there are certain material choices you have to make. If you want to make a vehicle that lasts that long, you're going to have to replace the interior at some point. And have you designed the interior to be economical to replace? And so a lot of these car sharing services that want to get these high mileages out of vehicles, you know, if you want to design for, it's one thing if you design for one customer to have the vehicle for a long period of time. It's another thing if you're going to have this rotating customer base where people aren't taking care of it as much as I'm sure you're taking care of your car. Which, by the way, my Charger got to 250,000, almost 250,000 miles before it got destroyed in a flood, my last one. So I got a second one. But there is, I mean, cars today are lasting a lot longer. If you look at the quality is problems per 100 vehicles, you know, they are getting better, but we haven't been designing cars for a total life cycle cost of operation. And one of the things working in the military, you know, they call it kind of the iceberg principle. When you're going to buy a new military vehicle, the reason why a military vehicle is, you know, or why a toilet seat costs $400 is not because it's $400 to buy it. It's the entire life cycle cost of purchasing and operating a particular piece of equipment is considered as part of the budget when you buy it to begin with. And so when you buy a military truck, it's not what's it cost to buy, it's how much does it cost to buy, what does it cost to fuel, what is the maintenance going to cost, what is the refurb going to cost at 250,000 miles, and if this thing is going to be expected to last for 20 years and 1 million miles, what is it going to cost during that entire time frame? Build that into your budget today. And because of that, because all of those things are considered up front, military vehicles are designed with very different considerations than our you know, passenger cars. They're designed to be torn apart and put back together. There's a lot of part sharing in very unconventional ways in military vehicles to keep you know, forward supply lines of inventory down. They're now moving towards 3D printing in a very heavy way, largely for part storage inventory reduction, not because 3D printing isn't a very cheap way of manufacturing parts today, but if it means you don't have to keep parts around for decades to be able to service a vehicle during its lifespan, you know, there are costs in that. So I think, you know, we have the technology to be able to build vehicles that last longer periods of time. There is interest in companies who want to pursue these kind of mobility as a service platforms to be able to go after that. In the 1930s and 50s, Ford was trying to build cars out of stainless steel, which a lot of transit buses are made out of today. The bodies lasted, you know, back then over 1 million miles, but they had to have new suspension and new wheels and new powertrains. Just like with the buses, the economics though is that a car has about 20 man hours of labor put to assemble it, to put, you know, all the parts together. A bus is 6,000 man hours of labor. And so if it takes you 1,000 man hours to tear apart the bus and refit it, as opposed to 6,000 to build a new one, there's an economics to doing that. If it takes you 1,000 hours to tear apart a car and put it together a new one, you might as well buy a new car at that point. So we're going to have to think through kind of the total cost of ownership optimization if we want to be able to design cars to last on that scale. That being said, we can make cars today that with the original driveline, with the original powertrain, can get to 250,000 miles without a major overhaul. We can do so fairly reliably. But going beyond that, we're going to have to think about how we design.
Do you think we are doing that, or are the auto manufacturers doing that?
I can't tell you about the conversations we're having at Chrysler, but I can imagine if other automakers are asking similar questions, that it's not the biggest topic on the conversation, but it's something that, you know, at least my experiences has been, is starting to be considered, so.
Do you know what the estimate is with electric vehicles?
So if you go through, the organization is probably one of the best jobs at looking at total life cycle ownership for transit vehicles is the Federal Transit Authority has done buses. And if you look at an electric vehicle, the powertrain is going to be different, but the rest of the vehicle is going to be the same. And so the limiting factors on bus power transmission has to be redone at 500,000 miles. I think the engine has to be tuned up at 250,000 miles, but you have to replace the HVAC system at like 200,000 miles, and you have to replace the seats at 300,000 miles or something like that. I forget the exact numbers. And so the powertrain is one part of it, but even the drive units on electric trains have to be overhauled at 250,000 miles.
There's another.
Yeah.
There's another consideration too. A commercial ride service vehicle may go 250,000 miles in 3 years.
Right, it's a duration.
And the powertrain will be worn out. You could replace that, but then the technology may be the driving factor in scrapping the vehicle and getting a new one.
Very true.
Right. It's been amortized in a much shorter period of time, which allows it to be sort of rotated out.
So this is another consideration for what's called the Army AMAS project. I spent 6 years with the Army on autonomous trucks, but we realized that the autonomy systems and the sensors are going to evolve at a much faster rate than the vehicle platform. The platform we're going to expect to keep for 20 years. We have to make changes to the platforms for the drive-by-wire and these types of technologies to make them robust. But you know, if we can do that once in the life cycle of a military vehicle over 20 years, but upgrade the autonomy system as the technology comes along, it's much easier to upgrade a sensor or a computer than it is to upgrade a brake modulator. Anything you'd have to tear into the vehicle platform. The other thing is, not all missions require the same level of autonomy. So as part of the CAD program, Capability Advancement Demonstrator, we had a level 4 autonomous vehicle leading around a bunch of level 3 autonomous vehicles, where the lead vehicle had much more capability than the remaining vehicles, and it told the other vehicles kind of what to do. They still had sensing, they could still avoid things that jumped out in front of them, but you didn't need to have every vehicle with the same level of intelligence. In many urban environments, you may put the intelligence in the infrastructure. It may make sense for very dangerous intersections to do more intersection-based or more infrastructure-based communication, especially now that 5G is becoming so capable. But upgradability of the technology, extensibility of the technology, designing for a future that you haven't thought of yet is something that we're going to have to do a much better job at. It's something the DoD has been doing a good job at, but as long as we've been thinking about kind of cars as being disposable, you know, we're just trying to get to a point where we can put apps on cars, because that hadn't been the business model up to this point. If you wanted to get a new telematic system, you got a new car. I think that's starting to change.
Yeah, for me, that's the interesting thing about cars. My car, 2000, manual transmission, AM/FM radio, wind down the crank windows, no nothing. And I see the cars that my friends are driving that are a couple of years old that have automated everything. And it seems like when there's a minor problem, into the shop it goes. The chips and the sensors and everything to replace it are fairly expensive. So far, mine, it's all mechanical, and the mechanics seem to be able to swap out a part and get it running very economically.
I mean, you have to do a total cost of ownership analysis. I mean, I can tell you the things that used to be really expensive to fix. The reliability of powertrain controls are a lot better now than they used to be. You don't do a tune-up really on a car, and now you've got cars that don't even have spark plug changes during their life frames, and the electronics have gotten really robust. So that aspect of the car, if you're buying a car that didn't have all the radars and the fancy gadgets, the raw reliability of the base vehicle has gotten really high. But the problem is every time we get certain parts to be more robust, we add new parts that are new and not robust. So, but, yeah.
Thanks for your trip down memory lane. It was very nice to see. And it's interesting that a lot of this seems like it's science fiction, right? Just like Da Vinci had some great designs, but he just didn't have the materials or the design tools to bring it around. So we come up with concepts in the 50s and 60s. Yeah, this is where we want to be. But it really took us to get to the semiconductor and the microchip to be able to have the actual product. So what do you see going forward? You know, again, we're making a lot of assumptions as far as, it seems like we're there with the technology, but what about the infrastructure, right? The public acceptance, the integration with legacy variations of vehicles, because we've got, 20 billion miles worth of legacy cars right now on the road, right? And they're not going to go away in the next 10, 20 years at least.
So that was part of the reason why the technology at the time didn't work. Theoretically, talking to the people who worked on it, we could have had an automated highway system who said, okay, we're willing to give up all legacy cars, we're willing to give up driving. The technology at the time could work. It was the same basic technology that allowed ballistic missiles to work. We knew how to do large, complex systems, but we didn't know how to do intercompatible systems that had all the new working together. And to a lot of extent, we've gotten better with that. The whole point of getting away from infrastructure and going towards vehicle-based sensing, allowed for Waymo cars that can share the road with other road users. The big challenge, like I said, user acceptance, I think, is the number one challenge. I'd say the number two challenge is verification and validation. If you look at a lot of the complex systems over the decades, avionics and missile systems, we had to limit the tools we used to design them and how we developed software for them to things we knew how to verify and validate with mathematical formulas, because you could never put 1 billion hours on an airplane to be able to say, yes, it can go 1 billion hours between failure. But the 787 is certified to 1 billion hours between failure, even though it has 8,000 test hours on it. Or sorry, 5,000 test hours. They put people in a 787 when it's only been tested for 5,000 hours, yet it's supposed to go 10 to the 9, 10 to the 10 hours between catastrophic failure. The only reason they can say that is because they have models based on assumptions about how they design the software. As soon as you use new methodologies, you have the tools to be able to do the verification. And that's one of the reasons why the DoD failed to get 1/3 of the deep strike aircraft autonomous by 2010 and 1/3 of the ground combat vehicles autonomous by 2015 was not that they didn't have autonomy. The DoD has the autonomy to be able to do these. They weren't able to prove that it was safe. They weren't able to meet their own internal safety processes that said you have to be able to show through testing or through analysis that this vehicle is not going to go and kill the people it's designed to protect. And we can, as the auto industry, can put millions of miles on a vehicle. The DoD can't. They can put thousands of miles on vehicles. Yet either way, we have to show that they have to go to billions of miles between fatality. In fact, if you look at all drivers today, humans go 100 million miles between fatalities in the US. If you take out drunk drivers, drowsy drivers, and distracted drivers, we go over 1 billion miles between fatality in the US. And that is assuming that the customer is willing to accept a parity with how good humans are. And so the ability to show these very high levels of reliability and safety just to get to human levels, I think is a challenge that we haven't solved yet.
And what's interesting too is the software. I mean, all those old films, they never contemplated software, right? You look at Star Wars, I mean, R2-D2 plugs in. There's no patches, he communicates to everything. It's like,
I would say they did consider software back then, but keep in mind, by the way, GM was the Google of its day. GM wrote the first operating system in the late 1950s. It was the first operating system in the industry. They had the first computer graphics. There were papers talking about someday computers would be small enough to put them in cars, but it was it was science, in their mind, science fiction. That was one of the things they had a hard time getting their head around, miniaturization of the computer to that small of a level. Controls and vacuum tubes, they knew how that worked, but computers were a different, new beast at the time. Oh, yeah.
I just wanted to comment. I love seeing this history.
as a long-term SAE member, but also a published historian. I just ate up on this stuff. But there's some lessons learned from the aero community that can translate over to the automotive world. Did you know that in the 1950s, the Air Force decided to automate prompts, warnings, and alerts to air crews about certain conditions that were happening? And they found that only female voices were obeyed.
I had heard, I had just something like that.
Yeah. They immediately dismissed barking commands from men. But you know, they stopped and listened to the females, and I mean, look at your phone. Siri is a female.
You can change it.
I kind of like the HAL 9000 voice myself.
Sorry, Dave.
All right, I think we could go on for quite a while longer, but in the interest of also getting this place wrapped up, thank you very much, Daniel, for the fascinating presentation. And you're welcome to stick around a little bit, have private conversations, but then, you know, we also want to get out of here at some point. So, thanks very much for